Hi everybody. It's so great to see people in person at an in-person event. My name is Professor Kadji. I am faculty in the Department of Comparative Literature. We are so pleased to welcome you all today to a talk by Professor Kadji Amin. Kadji Amin is Associate Professor of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Emory University. Professor Amin's research focus is on the disorienting effects of the queer and transgender past on politicized fields of scholarship. He's published articles in journals including TSQ, GLQ, Social Text, Differences, and Women's Studies Quarterly. And he also serves on the editorial board for TSQ and is the State of the Field essay editor for GLQ. His first book, Disturbing Attachments, Genealogy, Modern Pederasty, and Queer History, published by Duke UP in 2017, won an honorable mention for Best Book in LGBT Studies from the GLQ caucus of the MLA. The book de-idealizes Jean Genet's coalitional politics with the Black Panthers and Palestinians by foregrounding their animation by unsavory and outdated modes of attachment, including pederasty, racial fetishism, nostalgia for prison, and fantasies of queer terrorism. And currently, Professor Amin is working on two book projects. The first, Backwards Trans Theory, is an academic monograph that theorizes from the perspective of those rendered backward by contemporary trans discourse, transsexuals, butches, fairies, and street queens on the one hand, and gender complex people from the non-West on the other hand. And the second project, Brown Trans Misfit, is an experimental memoir that upends the conventions of trans narratives. Today, Professor Amin will present a talk titled, We Are All Non-Binary, A Brief History of Accidents. So please join me again in welcoming Professor Kadji Amin.
Wow, thank you so much for that warm welcome. And I'm so happy to see everybody in the room today. What a beautiful audience. If anybody else comes in, maybe you can motion them towards sitting on that wooden thing that's sticking out there. So first of all, I want to thank Chris Trujillo, Kristen, the CSGS and Comparative Literature for inviting me here. I'm really excited to bring this conversation here. This is something that I wrote up as an article that's about to be published actually in a special issue of Representations on Judith Butler, right? So if you are excited by the talk, you won't have to wait to cite it and read it. This is the only time that I'll be presenting it in public, so I'm really excited. Well, I mean, maybe future versions, but I'll be really, really excited to see what your feedback is. And this is part of the book project that was mentioned on Backwards Trans Theory, right? So I'll be developing it further for that. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how this originated and go into the talk from there. So let's see. Great. This talk originated as my effort to historicize a change that I witnessed, first in the Gender and Sexuality Studies undergraduate classroom at Emory, and later in American youth culture more broadly. Over the last 5 years, the number of undergraduate students I teach who use they, them pronouns has been multiplying, a trend that culminated in a trans studies course I taught in fall of 2021, in which, for the first time, the majority of students used they, them pronouns. When I first started seeing this change, I have to admit that I was thrilled. My initial interpretation is that these students were doing one of four things. One, bringing back genderqueer identity, which I understood as this was my particular understanding, right? As a heroic attempt to carve out an inhabitable space between man and woman. Two, marking a rejection of their assigned sex while they considered transition. Three, asserting a transmasculine but not male identity, a common enough desire, given the relative social legibility that the history of butch identity has lent transmasculinity, and the reluctance of many transmasculine people to become the oppressor, that is, men. And four, asserting a transfeminine but not female identity, this a relatively new development. The danger and unimaginability of the space between manhood and trans womanhood is illustrated by the fact that many trans women continue attempting to pass as men while they transition until their bodies change enough to allow them to switch to living as full-fledged women. Something that really doesn't have a parallel in terms of trans masculinity. As someone who had tried to live in between genders before transitioning, all of these possibilities, but particularly the attempt to open up a space between manhood and trans womanhood struck me as necessary and worth celebrating. It may be that I was right about some of these students, but it was not until last fall that I began to suspect that I was wrong about most of them. My first clue was that, interestingly, in terms of gender presentation and mannerism, most of the they-them students I was teaching by then, who I then understood to be non-binary, did not appear to be expressing trans masculinity, trans femininity, or even genderqueerness. I began to realize that this was not a linear progress narrative in which already existing but marginal positions began claiming more and more social space. Something qualitatively new, yet with tendrils in what came before, was afoot. This talk offers a polemical genealogy of the emergence of non-binary identity, not as a progress narrative in which we move towards an enlightened recognition of the many types of human, gender, and sexual diversity, but rather as the outcome of a slow avalanche of historical accidents. I consider the harms that the coinage and idealization of normative identities, from heterosexual to cisgender to binary, has wrought on ordinary gender variant people, particularly trans femmes, across the 20th and 21st centuries. Along with idealization, I identified divergence, binarism, and autology as the four logics that have driven the historical production of new categories of gender and sexuality. I conclude with a proposal for how we might throw a wrench in this Western identity machine. So, the divergence of transgender from homosexual. I begin by glossing a tale David Valentine has already told, that of the divergence of transgender from homosexuality in the US. I do so to underscore one engine of this entire history, the triumph of a divergence over a convergence model of gender sexuality, a term I prefer to gender and sexuality since the two are in reality indissociable. The convergence model, which was dominant until roughly the 1990s, held that local forms of race, class, and labor-differentiated gender sexual deviance were nevertheless all homosexual. For instance, the widespread agreement during the 1960s that street queens, male-assigned people who dressed in drag full-time, drag queens, hormone queens, male-assigned people who took estrogen, effeminate gay men, and butch gay men were all homosexuals might retrospectively be understood as a convergence model, since a range of social types was understood to cohabit a social category together. Following Esther Newton's ethnography of drag queens during the 1960s, we might propose that the centrality of drag performance in North American gay male subcultures, which continues today, had to do with its status as a ritual performance of homosexuality itself, before an audience of homosexuals who did not dare express their homosexuality to such a flagrant and abject extreme. The sentiments from admiration and envy to disapproval and disgust that drag performance inspired in homosexual men during the 1960s stemmed from the fact that they saw in drag performance a funhouse mirror of their own stigma, exaggerated and flaunted to an excess at once abject and sublime. For Newton, the operative distinction between drag queens, I meant to print it on separate pages, not front and back. Street queens and hormone queens on the one hand, and butch homosexuals on the other hand, is less femme versus masc than it is overt versus covert. Transfemininity here is less a discrete gender than it is an overt expression of the feminized, sexualized, and impoverished stigma of so-called male homosexuality in general during the mid-century. This cohabitation within the social category of gay or homosexual of a range of gendered, racialized, and classed types of queens and men did not make for harmony. A number of scholars have demonstrated how this convergence model of homosexuality produced strife in managing the uneven social stigmas of the covert homosexuality of butch gay men who were capable of functioning in the straight professional world, and the overt gender variant homosexuality of drag queens and street queens, who were forced to rely economically on gay and illegal street economies, right? So one thing I love about Esther Newton's work is that she points out that this really was a class division, right? In terms of what spaces you could go into, what kinds of labor you could perform, and so on. And I think this gets taken out of so many, contemporary queer analyses. From the vantage point of the 1960s, the gay liberation politics of coming out of the closet amounted to an injunction to the coverts to become overt. Nobody could have predicted that when they did so, it would be not as the screaming queens that they were all assumed to harbor deep within, but as men. The open declaration of homosexuality by otherwise gender-typical men changed the face of homosexuality during the 1970s, not the least for gay men themselves. Meanwhile, the shift from a semi-secretive gay subculture to a publicly politicized gay movement brought the resentments and ambivalences that had long bubbled between different gay social types to an open boil. As Valentine had shown, gay politicization during the 1970s led to debates about which homosexuals would have to be left behind so that other, more palatable homosexuals could make a feasible plea for rights to the straight public. Unsurprisingly, gender-typical gay men positioned screaming queens associated with sex work, public gender deviance, poverty, crime, and racialization as a detriment to the gay movement. In her now famous "Y'all Better Quiet Down" speech at the 1973 Gay Pride rally, Puerto Rican street queen Sylvia Rivera angrily demanded inclusion in the gay movement based on the hardship she bore on behalf of gay liberation. No one argued that queens like Rivera were not gay, only that they were not gay in socially palatable, read white middle-class ways. These, in short, were battles fought out within the tensions of the convergence model. For both gay, lesbian, and trans people, the category, let's see, I feel like, no, this is, whoa, sorry. Whoa. I've lost track of the little cursor.
Oh, it's on the screen.
Oh, okay. Whoa. Sorry, I think I don't understand this computer. The whole thing disappeared.
You got it.
Okay, so I need to go to slide number 2. I'm not quite sure what happened.
Oh, yeah. There we go.
Okay, here we go. Thank you. For both gay, lesbian, and trans people, the categorical divergence of transgender from homosexuality offered a number of benefits. After gay liberation, the growing visibility and numerical prominence of gender-typical lesbians and gays made it seem like common sense that butches and screaming queens were not the essence of all homosexuality as had once been thought. In this changed context, embracing what had once been a merely medical distinction between gender and sexuality allowed trans people to explain to a public that still saw them as a version of homosexual why they resorted to extreme measures that gays and lesbians did not, such as cross-dressing, name and pronoun changes, and at times hormonal or surgical transitions. In terms of political organizing, it had become apparent that the causes of gender deviance would always be a low priority within the gay and lesbian movement. Autonomous transgender organizing with roots in groups like STAR or Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, as well as transvestite and transsexual mutual aid, seemed necessary. Finally, embracing the separation of gender and sexuality allowed trans people to openly explore an array of sexualities, not just the homosexuality, that is, the heterosexuality, once a change in gender categories is accounted for, that was long expected of them. Valentine convincingly argues that the category of transgender gave lesbians and gays what they had been seeking for decades: distance from the stigma of gender variance in its association with poverty, illegal sex work, street culture, and race. Divergence seemed like a win for everyone. Okay, so should I just hit this arrow?
Just hit the arrow to the right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
There we go. So the cis-trans binary. So skip to 2008. Around 2008, the surprisingly rapid uptake of the term cis short for cisgender, by educated young trans people and their allies, reified the hitherto tacit binary between trans people and everyone else. As A. Finn Enck explains, cisgender was coined by biologist Dana Leland DeFoss in 1994. The scientific origin of the term accounts for the use of the little-known Latin prefix cis for that which remains in place. Subsequently, small numbers of trans people took up the technical-sounding term, but nobody expected it to take off until it did. Some early users of the term cisgender, such as Enck, understood it as an analytic of the unseen privilege and power of a set of common assumptions, that gender was visible and obvious, that sex was immutable, that gender was a natural biological expression of sex. The version of cisgender that was popularized around 2008, however, was neither an analytic of privilege nor a term for regulatory technologies of gender and sex, but rather an identity category for all non-trans people. The use of cis as an identity was intended to mark the otherwise unmarked normalcy of those who did not desire transition. Its effect, however, was to ossify the opposition between trans people and the rest. Quickly, the cis-trans binary was reinterpreted as an ontological truth. Only a distinct category of people named transgender desired transition and exhibited gender variance. The rest, cis people, were perfectly comfortable in their sex bodies and gendered social roles. We may generatively extend Judith Butler's questioning of the status of heterosexuality within lesbian theorization in 1998 to the status of cisgender today. So Butler writes in an afterwards to a volume on butch femme, have we begun to construct heterosexuality as a normative monolith in order to set into relief the variegations of non-heterosexual desire as the unambiguous and uncontaminated forces of sexual opposition? So we might ask, what is the background figure of cisgender at work here? When we refer to normative cisgender, do we know precisely what we mean? Oh, there we go. Have we begun to construct cisgender as a normative monolith in order to set into relief the variegations of trans identity as the unambiguous and uncontaminated forces of gender opposition? In short, are we idealizing cisgender as uncontaminated by any gender trouble whatsoever, just as we have idealized heterosexuality as untainted by the slightest homosexual longing? If this is the case, then we might expect cisgender people to be far less straightforwardly cis than the cis-trans binary would lead us to expect. After all, Jane Ward's research has made it clear that homosexual sex between straight-identified people is ubiquitous rather than rare among gay men and women in the United States today. Might cisgender as a category be just as impure as heterosexual? To us, this question is not necessarily to imply that transgender and homosexual are symmetrical terms. While some degree of homosexual desire is likely so ubiquitous as to be almost universal, I would argue that no more than a tiny sliver of non-trans identified people harbor the secret desire to change their sex. This basic material asymmetry is distorted, however, by taxonomies and definitions that have been devised for transgender based on the pre-existing model of the homosexual-heterosexual divide. To tell the story of cisgender, then, we must back up and explain the historically contingent emergence of heterosexuality. So this is heterosexuality's privileged unreality. As Jonathan Ned Katz has shown us, heterosexuality emerged belatedly as a normative ballast against homosexuality. Homosexuality, the abnormal type, was defined first by sexologists beginning in the late 19th century and psychiatrists in the 20th century. If homosexuality came to describe a type of person defined by an abnormal and pathological same-sex desire, one of the many epistemological problems it introduced was that there was no concept for a healthy, normal desire for the opposite sex. Heterosexuality was an afterthought to homosexuality, its belatedness a symptom of its purely ideological origins. As fictive as it is idealized, heterosexuality today names an exclusive, normal, and healthy sexual orientation to the opposite sex that hardly exists in practice. The first paradox of heterosexuality is that it defines as healthy and normal a form of sex and coupledom based on material power asymmetries between men and women, and therefore on the basic psychosexual interplay of sadism, masochism, desire, disgust, and sex rape, analyzed by feminist scholars such as Catherine McKinnon. To restore the contents of patriarchy and sexism to heterosexuality is to reveal it to be a constitutively perverse form of sexual desire, healthy only by virtue of its statistical predominance and pervasive idealization. The second paradox of heterosexuality is that there are, I would wager, no heterosexuals who have neither experienced nor acted on same-sex erotic desire, even if only in the form of aggression or play. Heterosexuality as an exclusive sexual orientation is and has always been a myth. And much of the history of sexology could be re-narrated as an attempt to rationalize the fact that a great many apparently normal people had sex with someone of the same sex. Butler's insight is that queer thought inadvertently shores up the idealization of a pure and uninterrogated heterosexuality whenever it opposes queer, gay, lesbian to straight. Going further, we might argue that heterosexuality's privileged unreality is precisely what makes it possible for people to claim it, despite and even in light of their own homosexual activities and desires. For claiming heterosexuality has always been, first and foremost, a means of aspiring to an idealized normalcy. As Ward powerfully argues, heterosexuality is not a naturally existing sexual orientation, but rather a culture. Feeling comfortable and at home in straight culture is more powerfully predictive of heterosexual identification than is an exclusive desire for the opposite sex. The prehistory of heterosexuality reveals why this is the case. Before heterosexuality, there were the normals, and then there were the gender variants. Fairies and queens, butches and he-she's, hermaphrodites and sexual intermediaries. Properly manly men were by definition normal, at least when it came to gender sexuality, even when they were having manly insertive sex with fairies or queens. Women who were imagined in different contexts to be asexual, polymorphously perverse, or exclusively responsive to the sexual advances of others have always been more difficult to fit into models of sexual normalcy versus deviance or of sexuality as orientation. So none of these models really fit women, right? No wonder then that many normals were and remain reluctant to recategorize themselves as deviant simply because of their gender-appropriate same-sex practices. If the homo-hetero-binary can be said to have victims, however, these victims would be not the normals, but rather trans women. If, as George Chauncey has argued, before heterosexuality, any normal working-class man might have desired a fairy without any diminishment, and even with a potential enhancement of his manhood, now heterosexual men who are attracted to trans women may commit acts of extreme transmisogynist violence to protect their heterosexual masculine status. The overkill, to quote Eric Stanley, that characterizes contemporary acts of transmisogynoir violence may therefore be one consequence of the hetero-homo divide. So this is The Losses of Queer History, with a hat tip to Heather Love for that title. The emergence of cisgender follows a similar pattern to that of heterosexuality. Transsexuality was coined first during the 1950s as a medical diagnosis of the strange desire to change sex. Transgender followed about 40 years later as an attempt to forge a politics and a sense of community around the demedicalized desire to be differently gendered. Like heterosexual, cisgender emerged belatedly, its meaning settling from an analytic of cisnormativity and privilege to the name assigned to a hypothesized normal type, the opposite of transgender. The problem is that in the meantime, the meaning of transgender had also shifted from a politicized umbrella for all manner of gender bending to the neutral descriptor of a misalignment between someone's gender identity and their assigned gender. This newer definition of transgender, moreover, was actually a return to the mid-century sexological and psychiatric theories of gender that were the basis of intersex medical violence, right? So a part of my research is really interested in how this sexological model has triumphed, historically speaking, and we've forgotten that it is sexological. One consequence of this series of coinages and definitional shifts is that the cisgender transgender binary has a gaping hole in the middle. If in the past gender variance epitomized by the queen was the definitional center of homosexuality, now in a historically shocking reversal, homosexuality has become gender typical by default. Transgender people, initially anyone differently gendered, and now informally only those who desire transition, have become the sole gender variants. Everyone else is cisgender. So what has happened to all the gender variants who do not desire transition? Put differently, what are the contemporary fates of those who would have been fairies, queens, and butches in the past? Butches, in fact, remain common, due both to the high value of masculinity in lesbian culture and to the overall ill fit between female-assigned people and in the hegemonic history of sexuality. The real question, then, is what has happened to the fairies and queens? No doubt a great many would have either elected to transition or settled into a relatively stigma-free, gender-typical homosexuality. Given the erotic and cultural value of masculinity among gay men, feminine gay men who do not desire transition have become something of a paradox. Stereotypically gay, yet rarely considered desirable within gay male culture, the slogan, "No fats, no femmes, no Asians," epitomizes this mask-for-mask gay culture that's now hegemonic. Feminine gay men have become historical, redolent of homosexualities of yore, yet deprived of even a single affirmative term to identify them, much less articulate a positive desire for them. Tellingly, not a single tribe on the gay sex app Grindr names feminine gay men or those who might desire them. Trans, by contrast, is a named tribe. Feminine men have become erotic nonentities, desired more often than not, despite rather than for their femininity. They are the fallouts of both the cis-trans and the homo-hetero-binary. If during the early 20th century any normal man might have desired them, now no heterosexual man is permitted to, and few gay men find themselves so moved. Enter non-binary. Such are the consequences of an ill-conceived taxonomy that sought to counterfactually and in an affront to the entirety of queer history, including globally, right, neatly sort people into cisgender versus transgender. That is, until just now. In keeping with the trend towards divergence as a strategy for managing taxonomical tensions, the cis-trans distinction has birthed a third term, non-binary, which, unlike its seldom used precursor, genderqueer, has caught on like wildfire in a few short years. Initially, in harmony with my initial supposition, non-binary, an umbrella term for all those who identify as neither men nor women, promised a much-needed home to all those historically orphaned, first by the divergence of transgender from cisgender, and then by the cis-trans binary. However, before this home even solidified, the ground beneath it turned to quicksand, and the term began to mean something else. Specifically, non-binary started being claimed by people who look and behave in a manner indistinguishable from ordinary lesbians and gays, or even ordinary heterosexuals. While Miley Cyrus, Courtney Stodden, and Janelle Monáe have recently made headlines by coming out as non-binary, this phenomenon, as my own classroom experience attests, is hardly confined to the rich and famous. A 2021 survey by the Trevor Project estimates that 26% of LGBTQ youth in the US ages 13 to 24 now identify as non-binary, a proportion that will be familiar to those of us who teach in the queer and trans classroom. How did this come about? If in the early 2000s, genderqueer was an almost unimaginable category understood to apply to almost no one, how has non-binary become a ubiquitous category that could seemingly apply to almost everyone? One precondition for the universalization of non-binary identity is the trans idealization of cisgender. To paraphrase Butler yet again, have we begun to construct cisgender as a normative monolith in order to set into relief the variegations of trans and non-binary identity as the unambiguous and uncontaminated forces of gender oppression? The answer can only be a resounding yes. Keep in mind that cisgender is not and has never been a social identity. Like heterosexuality, cisgender is an opposite, fabricated out of thin air. This is not to say that there are not people who are not transgender, in the sense of people who do not desire transition. Indeed, if that were the definition of cisgender, all would be well. However, that is only the opposite of the colloquial definition of transgender, not of the official definition. The Oxford English Dictionary defines transgender as designating a person whose sense of personal identity and gender does not correspond to that person's sex at birth, or which does not otherwise conform to conventional notions of sex and gender. In a tidy and logical opposition, cisgender is defined as designating a person whose sense of personal identity corresponds to the sex and gender assigned to him or her at birth, in contrast with transgender. Similar definitions proliferate on the internet and on social media, the major sites of sexual gender identity formation for young people. What I find most striking about these new definitions is that cisgender and officially transgender are now defined as a matter of personal identity alone. But how does a gender-typical person go about developing a relation to their gender identity? In a context in which most gender-typical people have never had to think about their gender identity, when they look within to find some felt relation to it, they may well draw a blank. When they do find feelings about manhood and womanhood, these feelings are likely to be extremely ambivalent. How could they not be, since these terms are artifacts of patriarchal gender expectations and racialized civilizational distinctions? While they may have heard trans people talk about gender dysphoria, they will search in vain for the feeling that indicates cisness, for there is none. The main reason is that cisgender, the notion of an alignment so exact between one's personal sense of identity and the gender role assigned to one that there is no rub, no ambivalence, and no sense of constraint, is and has always been a fantasy. Nobody has ever felt that way. We trans people invented the fantasy of cisgender as the opposite to the extreme gendered and sexual discomfort we have experienced. We are the ones responsible for the idealization of cisgender, and it falls partly to us to undo it. As if cisgender were not bad enough, non-binary discourse has just invented a new fictive opposite. Just as homosexuality birthed and idealized heterosexuality and transgender birthed and idealized cisgender, non-binary has birthed an idealized binary identification as its ironically binary opposite. If a non-binary person identifies as neither man nor woman, a binary person not only does identify as a man or woman, but they, by connotation, do so in a binary way, that is, without any cross-gender feelings or identifications. The problem is that, thus understood, no one is binary. Neither the binary trans people most commonly opposed to non-binary people, nor the binary cis people who would never choose this term to describe themselves or their relationship to gender. Indeed, if non-binary is catching on like wildfire, it is no coincidence that binary is not. Almost no one, trans or cis, identifies as binary or finds this term a useful descriptor for their experiential relation to gender. Binary, to an even greater extent than cisgender or heterosexual, is an idealized opposite, not a lived state of being. Non-binary discourse has also taken gender self-identification far further than trans people ever envisioned. If trans people use the discourse of self-identification to ensure that our choices to transition, whether medically or socially, were respected, non-binary discourse has used self-identification to eliminate the necessity of transition, whether medical or social, altogether. Non-binary discourse holds firmly that non-binary might look any number of ways and need not find external expression in choice of dress, hairstyle, pronouns, or any other social marker of gender. This tenet definitely emerged as a way to counter the reflexive binary gendering even of visibly gender variant people, given the difficulty of appearing uncategorizable as either a man or a woman to those dead set on classifying everyone in this way. As a response, non-binary discourse has doubled down on the notion of gender as an internal psychic identification, adding the corollary that non-binary identification is valid regardless of outward expression. While many non-binary people do seek to modify their appearance to counter binary gendered expectations, with the discourse of gender self-identification, more and more do not. This confluence of events has created a context rife for the production of more and more non-binary people. For if, according to the logic of opposites, one must either be non-binary or binary, and it's radical to be non-binary and normative to be binary, then more and more people are choosing and will continue to choose non-binary identity. This is particularly true since non-binary identity costs very little. All that is required to be non-binary is to identify as such, and nobody will be attacked, imprisoned, thrown out of their home, or discriminated against merely for identifying as non-binary, right? It's the practices, it's the outward expressions, right, that cause those acts of discrimination and violence. One of the most popular current explanations of non-binary identity is that it is not, in fact, an additional gender, but rather a perspective or belief, a choice to see gender as a spectrum or limitless rather than as a binary. Today, a list of people I've encountered who identify as non-binary would include a white female-assigned person who has studied Buddhism and decided that ontologically gender is not binary, a number of female-assigned feminists who experience discomfort with patriarchal expectations, a number of transitioned trans people who wish to be out as trans and avow that their life history has not been within a single gender, a couple of people who wish to decolonize the colonial gender binary, and a number of Black folks for whom, due to a history of ungendering, Blackness precludes cisgender status. According to this logic, all woke people should be non-binary. Only the politically retrograde would subscribe to a binary gender identity, much less believe in binary gender at all, right? And if identity is a statement of belief, then not believing that gender is binary is enough of a reason to be non-binary. So none of these people's beliefs or feelings about gender is uninteresting or wrong. What I question contra current progressive gender discourse is whether one's politics, personal feelings, or beliefs about gender should be the basis of gender categorization at all. Like language, gender categories, including trans, cis, non-binary, and binary, are social and interpersonal, not individual. This is what makes them meaningful in the first place. If they were not, trans and non-binary people would not feel the need to announce our genders to the world any more than we feel the need to announce our favorite colors. What is socially relevant is transition, a shift in gender categories, whatever they may be, not identification, a personal, felt, and thereby highly phantasmatic and labile relation to these categories. Identification is the psychic process that makes the interval between the individual and the social apparent. It is not the site of their suture. Or, as Butler puts it, identification is not identity, a distinction that has been forgotten within non-binary discourse. While gender politics are socially relevant, it is only the neoliberal universalization of identity as the basis of all politics that has made it appear necessary to announce one's gender politics as an identity, non-binary, rather than simply enacting them. What is therefore necessary is to repair the historical wound opened by the cis-trans binary by creating one or more socially legible gender categories based on social data, such as presentation and behavior, not self-identification alone, for those who want to transition from men or women to something else, something with positive social content rather than something devoid of it, as non-binary currently is. And I think it is within our power to create such a transformation in the gender system. So, a wrench in the Western identity machine. As my brief history of accidents has shown, we have not moved from a rigid and impoverished gender system to a flexible and nuanced one. To the contrary, the Western history of gender sexuality has been one of the creation through the method of divergence as a means of managing categorical instability of increasingly idealized and uninhabitable normative categories, from heterosexual to cisgender to binary. It has been the history of the burial of gender, deeper and deeper within the private recesses of the self, where it increasingly disavows any relation to the social at all. If Butler wrote Gender Trouble in 1990 as a critique of the ascription of an interior core where there was nothing but compelled performances of social ideals of gender, according to her, in 2021, the fictive core of gender identity has taken on a life of its own. Gendered identity is envisioned not as derivative of, but as autonomous from the social, to the extent that it may entirely contradict one's actual gender performances. The popularization of femme, assigned female at birth, non-binary identity is one case in point. Today, gender identity references a core selfhood that requires no expression, no embodiment, and no commonality in the case of some of the micro-identities spreading on the internet with genders as they are lived by others in the world. In this sense, contemporary gender identity is the apotheosis of the liberal Western fantasy of self-determining autological selfhood, which names a regulatory ideal that gains meaning only in opposition to the genealogical selfhood overdetermined by social bonds ascribed to racialized and indigenous people. Non-binary identity is therefore not, as some non-binary, and I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A since I'm going fast right now. Non-binary identity is therefore not, as some non-binary people would have it, a radical refusal of the colonial gender binary. For binary Western thinking has governed every step in the history of Western gender sexual categories by generating an idealized opposite for each new category coined. The core binary that governs non-binary thought, however, is less that between binary and non-binary than that foundational to Western thought between the self-determining autological individual and the unchosen genealogical bonds of the social. It is therefore difficult to imagine an identity more provincially Western and less decolonial than contemporary non-binary identity. My brief history has also shown, however, that any problems with non-binary identity and discourse are not the fault of non-binary people alone. In keeping with the lessons of Foucaultian genealogy, they are the consequence of a slow avalanche of historical accidents. In sum, they are the fruit of, one, a turn to divergence as a means of managing the imperfection of identity categories, two, the use of binary thinking to fabricate fictive opposites, heterosexual, cisgender, binary, whose uninhabitability then spawns further divergent identities, which then spawn new fictive opposites, and so on. Three, the idealization of these identities, and four, the popularization of the Western Cartesian sexological thesis that gender is psychic rather than social. I propose that we throw a wrench in this identity machine. It may be necessary to generate new identities, given that non-binary is not a true social category, but rather a vast umbrella with no positive social content. However, we can abandon Western binary and taxonomic thinking by refusing to create a fictive opposite for each new term created. We can drop the notion that gender is purely psychic and instead work towards creating a livable, valued, and legible social category for trans femmes. Again, given the high cultural and erotic value of masculinity, a space for trans masks will likely always exist. Most importantly, we can stop idealizing and attempting to name some version of normal gender. And we can refuse to use the misleading terms binary and cisgender altogether. For just as there has never been a heterosexuality without homosexual desire, there has never been a cis or binary gender free from cross-identification or gender atypicality. All taxonomies are social fictions. All taxonomical borders will leak. Contamination is the companion of categorization. It is all but impossible to feel entirely unambivalent about, entirely described by a social identity category. This was never the goal of transgender or transsexual politics to begin with. The question then is whether we can develop a tolerance for contamination and for the inevitable misfit of identity categories rather than continually kicking the bucket further down the road, generating ever more terms in pursuit of an impossible dream, that of social categories capable of matching the uniqueness of individual psyches. To accomplish all of this, we must, first and foremost, relinquish the fantasy that gender is a means of self-knowledge, self-expression, and authenticity rather than a shared and thereby imperfect social schema. I believe this means developing a robust trans politics and discourse without gender identity. Thank you. Yeah, I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much. Such an interesting talk. I have like 6,000 questions for you. Try to exercise some. But yeah, this is so thought-provoking and interesting. I mean, I think what I would love to hear you reflect on is, I mean, the tendency to create identities, right, like gay or trans, right, is materially motivated, right? It's a direct product of the the political system that we live in, right? Which is like the sort of like rights-based advocacy that like pushes people into these groups. So I wonder if there isn't a tad bit of like victim blaming to kind of say that like, oh, well, you latched onto these categories which have then created these opposites because I don't think there was a real, like a materially possible counterfactual for achieving some of the like material gains that like the gay liberation movement has gotten, right? Or even in terms of like or like movement for trans rights, right? And I understand, like, as a radical person and as a radical thinker, I'm like, wow, what a shame, right? Like, I understand the critique, but I wonder about placing the onus of undoing these categories, or placing the sort of the blame or the moral, you know, the moral weight of these categories onto folks, especially since the sort of oppositional categories like straight, like cis, don't actually produce the same, are, I think, analytically different in that they don't produce the same sort of like, you know, people aren't like having straight pride, like, you know, like there isn't actually the same sort of collective identity, kind of like with whiteness, right? It's like this catch-all category that doesn't actually mean anything socially. And so I just wonder about, like the kind of moral weight that's being placed, and how do we make sense of that those distinctions between the sort of like analytical issues and the kind of political realities that folks have faced.
Yeah, that's a great question. And to be very clear, this is not like a traditional deconstructive critique of all identities, right? I think social identities are necessary, right? It's part of living in a society. I think they're necessarily imperfect, right? I understand that they change over time. And rather than putting the blame, I would suggest empowering, right? Because I feel like we actually do have the power to change social identity categories. And if we realize that, right, if we realize that, I mean, I think one thing that I see in contemporary, like the most recent wave, right, of non-binary discourse, and part of the reason that it has become about each person defining their gender the way that, the individual way that they see fit, right, is because I think behind that kind of utopianism is a kind of loss of hope that these genders will ever be legible in the social, right? So why bother? You know, there's this sense that like, well, everybody's going to misgender you, right? Nobody is going to you know, if you go to all this trouble to look a different way, people are going to misgender you anyway, right? So why bother? Why not just define it for yourself? And so part of the reason why I go back historically and talk about all these trans feminine gender categories that used to exist, right, is to show us that this is possible, right? And there have always been you know, I think there have been and continue to be very clear categories for transmasculine people that are socially recognizable, right? It is possible to have that for trans femininity as well. In fact, we are the historical and global anomaly in this sense, in refusing to recognize one for trans feminine people. And I think that this material politics that you're talking about, I absolutely do agree that it is material, but part of the consequence of this material politics has been what we might call gendercide, right? It's been the elimination of these entire categories of people, right, that have gone unmourned, right? So I think a lot about the contemporary discourse, which is often panicked and can be kind of turfy about all the butches, you know, we're losing all the butches, they're all becoming men, right? So I'm not with it when it does turn turfy, but on the other hand, I think that one positive thing it exemplifies is that there is a real respect and love for butches, right? nobody has mourned the loss of trans feminine categories. Nobody has said what happened to all the fairies. Like, nobody has thought it's a loss that that street queens no longer have their unique subjectivity, right? Nobody has said, wait, Sylvia Rivera said that she wasn't a woman, but that she liked to pretend, right? Nobody has said, why is that significant? And she's not unique there, right? That was a street queen way of being, right? Liking to pretend. And so part of what, so I'm entirely with you, like, yes, there's the material, there's the political. There are material issues like class, which I brought up in Mother Camp, right? So it's not just about like who you feel you are in the inside, but how much stigma you can bear, right? And who has nothing left to lose, right? So I think where I would like to see a change is, just in collective action around, aside from saying, okay, the one thing that collectively we can agree on is that everybody can define their gender as they wish, right? So a collectivity of absolute sovereign individuals, right? Instead of that, what if we said, right, we all share this gender system. We're all interconnected within us. It impacts us all. Some of us for better and some of us for worse, right? How can we come together and come to a collective agreement about how we want to change it, right? And how can we do that in a way that puts forward the needs of those who are rendered most vulnerable by the way the gender system works currently, right? So that's what I actually have in mind. Thank you. Yes?
Yeah, so I'm really curious about if you look at the history that you laid out, like, we're looking at like the repercussions of sexology, right? Which is
Yes.
trying to understand deviance as opposed to thinking about difference or variation. But like what you're describing now in this modern moment, it seems almost like sexology has dropped out and social media and capitalism have become the drivers, right? So if you think about Facebook being like, you have 47 options for gender, right? But this is the beginning of, capitalism loves micro-identities, right? I mean, there's nothing capitalism likes more than people coming up with micro-categories that you can sell t-shirts to or buttons or anything on, Cafe Press or whatever.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, that so much of this is tied in with social media,
Yeah,
right? I mean, in some ways, this is like the gender identity version of like signing, the anxiety about like activism becoming signing things online, right? Where it's like the no consequence, the no embodiment, something that you can do that's individual action. And so I'm curious, like, what you think about this kind of shift from sexology to like social media. Gender.
I think that's a fantastic question, and it's such a hugely important issue, right? And I think that, I mean, in a more fully developed version, I'm definitely going to say something about this, because I think this is a version of gender that's premised on the technology of the internet and social media, right? Because it's one where, in the social world, as this kind of the newest wave type of non-binary person is not going to be recognized as whatever identity they have, right? It's going to be a continual scene of misrecognition and of not having a kind of socially meaningful place, right? But it's entirely different on social media, where you can have a profile, you can have your pronouns, which can be any pronouns you want, right? Even ones that you make up. And then you can say below it exactly how you wish to be known, right? It can be a nouveau category, it can be, an established one, and that's the first thing that people know about you when they look at that, right? There's nothing like that in the embodied social world, right? And then also I think we have to take into account, if I locate this change, in terms of the population that I'm teaching at Emory over the last 5 years, the fact that during COVID, a lot of people were locked up at home with their cell phones and their laptops, right? And either transitioned or claimed a different gender identity, right? And a lot of this might have been positive and necessary, right? Something that would inevitably have happened anyway and for the best, right? But I think that scene of being at home during COVID, right, socially isolated except for your connection to the internet, and of identity coming to you via definitions, right? So part of this talk could be seen as kind of boring in that I'm just like naming all these definitions, right? But I think that is the way that identities are encountered nowadays, as definitions on the internet. And people say, oh, this definition, yeah, that actually kind of describes me. I guess that I'm that thing, right? Where, and you can really contrast it when, I was growing up and, you would still go out to the bar or the gay bar, right? And you would run into people and be like, oh my God, I just met, a real life trans man for the first time, and kind of get the sense of like, well, here are the positions that are possible within this community, right? This embodied community, and here is how one has to behave to fit into these positions, right? So it's a huge change in terms of how identity is brought about, but I think one of the consequences, because we still do sometimes live in an embodied social world, is that there is that mismatch between what is possible online and according to online discourse about gender as whatever you can choose and however you can define yourself and however you feel on the inside, right? And a social world in which nobody can tell how you feel on the inside and most people don't care, right? So yeah, that's very important. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a great talk. I actually have 2 questions that we can just pick and choose, I guess. The first question is pretty basic, but I was curious about if we thought about the relation between gender sub-identity versus what we might call broadly sexual orientation, and how the difference between like bisexual and pansexual as a category is like one difference that hasn't really caught up like wildfire in my experience, the way that non-binary has. Like people still seem to prefer the word bisexual as the more socially legible term versus pansexual, which ostensibly kind of is cautious of removing that gender binary. And the second question is more about the project as a whole, like whether you have an archive you use. You mentioned some sociological studies, but I was thinking of like contemporary avant-garde artists like Genesis Peorage, if you know her, or like Justin Vivian Vaughn. Yeah, so like the tradition of gender non-conforming performance artists that like really do extend their art into their own lives, and how in relation to social media perhaps like that does circulate, because I'm thinking of Genesis Peorage as an example. I'm apologize if you don't know her, but she just passed away, and she and her partner had this idea of like the androgyny, where they like underwent plastic surgery to look like each other. And after her partner died, she took on the pronoun we when she refers to herself and her late partner. And her posthumous memoir is called Non-Binary. And so whether there's like a different almost like lineage of that term in like the in like the mainstream context, and maybe like an avant-gardist I don't know, tradition, whether that's whether performance art is something that factors into your book.
Right. Yeah, great question. And so the answer is, I don't know, mainly no, right? Because I think, specifically avant-garde performance art, because I think that is the direction that a lot of queer studies and a lot of queer of color critique has tended to go in. And one thing, I mean, I've begun to think a little bit more like an empiricist, right? In that I'm interested in what ordinary people do, right? I'm less interested in the avant-garde than I am the ordinary drag queen in the ordinary gay bar, right? Because I think that there's a way you can take avant-garde anything, right? Especially if it's queer of color, and kind of imagine a cutting-edge new future based on it, right? Part of why this is backwards trans theory is because I want to return to the past, right? Based on the empirical traces we have of it. And I want to ask really different questions of it, questions that are theoretical, in fact, right? Like, why in the world has it been a tradition for decades, right? Since the pre-Stonewall period, for groups of gay men to gather and watch either a gay man or a trans woman or somebody who is undefined, right? Put on women's clothing and enact this drag spectacle, which is part glamorous, part hilarious, part mean and cruel, and so on, right? So what we're talking about there is, I think that actually academics have done a pretty terrible job talking about drag in terms of its social significance, right? Because it's not about parodying gender, at least in its kind of subcultural role, right? It's about something else, right? And so I feel like Esther Newton is actually the one who gets closest to it when she says that this is a collective ritual, right? A collective community ritual. And if you understand it like that, then you have to ask, well, what is the purpose of this ritual, right? Why are these men gathering, if they are men, right, to watch this drag queen? Given given the critiques of mainstream gay men for their exclusions of trans femininity and hatred of trans women and so on, right? Why do they gather again and again to celebrate and to lionize these drag queens who sometimes are trans women, right? I think there's an entire history buried within this that is available to us. Esther Newton has already written about it. It's not hidden. That's a canonical text, right? But we haven't cared to think about it. So I want to go back to this entire archive. I'm looking at Esther Newton as a kind of historical record, right? Just everywhere where you find these historical records, there are some literary figures. I do want to revisit Jean Genet's Notre Dame des Fleurs, Our Lady of the Flowers, to just think about the relationship between some kind of proto-gay masculinity or pederastic masculinity and trans femininity, right? And the complex emotions of desire and disgust and disavowal and abjection and adulation, right, that are part of that. And then think about, I think that one thing that has happened is in this effort to affirm trans womanhood, right, there's been a real cutting off of trans women from gay male culture or from, queer culture in general. And I think that with certain trans women, right, not all of them, there are really important historical links there. So basically, I want to reread the entire history of Western sexuality as a history of transness, right? Because I think transness was at the center, and the tale of how it got forced out, right, is a really violent one that we cover up when we say, yay, gay liberation, right? And that gets further buried when we think, wow, for the first time, we have trans youth today and we're supporting them, right? There's a giant historical omission that's gone on, and we really need to think about that in all kinds of critical, theoretical, and empirical ways. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kadji. So I'm thinking about something that you said in response to Iman's question, which was that you said something like, no one's mourning trans femmes.
Yeah.
And so I have a question about, I guess, maybe the affective relationship that you have to your methodology and historical methodology. And so I guess the basic question is what is the role of mourning and grief in your project? And I'm thinking about this not only in terms of your own relationship to a particular history, our own relationship to a longer history, but also are there, in fact, like tangible rituals of mourning that are interesting for your project as well? Or are there ways of thinking about what you seem to characterize as more sort of adulatory kinds of rituals, like, gay men going to see drag queens, if there is also a way in which you're thinking about those as also like a kind of representation of grief or something like that. So yeah.
Wow, that's a great question, Chris, because I feel like it points in the direction of where I have a presentiment that this project might go, right? Because as I was thinking about this talk last night, and I was thinking about what I wanted to convey in the Q&A, right? What I thought was important. It was really this question of mourning that came up for me. Like, how is it that there was this entire vibrant gender category, right, that transformed over time? We've never told the story of, Chauncey has talked about the fairies of the 1930s, right? How did they become the street queens of the 1960s? What's the connection between them and the street queens of the 1960s, the drag queens of the 1960s, right? Like, there are all these historical gaps, and we've just let them stay. We haven't even been interested in drawing a line from one to the other, much less filling in the gaps, right? And so yeah, I think that as I was thinking about this last night, that question of mourning and what is unmourned, right, became really central. And I think, part of the unmourning has to do with the glee with which a lot of gender typical gay men in the 1970s were like, wow, we can like come out of the closet, and as long as we, are masculine, people will respect us at least to some extent, right? And a real change in patterns of gay male desire towards desiring each other rather than desiring straight men, right? There's this amazing moment in this film about Quentin Crisp, an Englishman in New York, right? And I want to read Crisp as a fairy, but an upper middle class one. Unfortunately, they're the few who left records. But he is dressed in his kind of outrageous way, which is very similar to 1930s fairies in the 1980s, and he's in New York. A friend, a younger American friend, takes him to a gay bar, and they're sitting there watching all these clones, these heavily muscled men who are dressed like construction workers or something like that. And Crisp has this reading of them where he says, well, so I guess nowadays everybody has decided that in order to have his great dark man, because he always talked about the great dark man as his masculine ideal, right? Which for him was a straight working class man, right? In order to have his great dark man, he must first become him, or at least look like him. But which of these are the real men, and which of these are essentially the fairies pretending to be one in order to have one, right? And it's a hilarious moment from the point of view of the present, because you're like, well, what a funny way to think of like gay culture, right? But I think when you think about it, you see a historical reality on the part of many of these men, right? And it's the point of view of the fairy which has been excluded from queer histories, right? Rather than that of the gender typical gay man who has written the histories as one of triumph, right? Yay, gay liberation, yay, gay rights, right? So what is the history of that loss, right? And can I galvanize people to actually think of that as a loss, right? I mean, I think I have a deeply personal relation to trans femininity in that I'm in a relationship with a trans woman, but also I think before I transitioned, I knew that I wanted to be a faggot, I was like, that's what I want to be, not a man, but a faggot, right? And then when I did, I was like, oh, that was actually a very pre-Stonewall idea of what homosexuality was. Faggots are out of style, like not a thing, not a thing anymore. And so yeah, so for me, it is deeply personal and kind of idiosyncratic. Like I don't purport to generalize that in any kind of way. But I think that it should be a real loss, and that if we care about trans women and trans femininity, I mean, I think that nowadays politically they're being singled out as like these extremely vulnerable subjects that are potentially radical and that have been left out of a lot of queer communities, politics, histories, etc., and that we need to hold up now, right? If we want to do that, we should go all the way, right? And we should think about the ways that trans femininity has permeated all of these histories and permeated all these subject positions that are seen as distant from them, right? So I think in a way, it's a methodology that's about relationality, right? So it's about thinking trans femininity relationally instead of saying, well, here is this category of people that is and has always been entirely separate and distinct, right? That's all I can say for now, right? But I am definitely going to think more about this question of mourning. Yeah.
Time for one more question.
Yeah, Riley.
Thank you so much for this fantastic talk, and I really look forward to reading and citing and teaching the forthcoming essay. I've got kind of two questions as well. One about the kind of idealization of cisgender, which I kept thinking about dysphoria and euphoria often at various moments, and started to think about this kind of idealization of cis as kind of a dysphoric projection. And I'm curious about, especially as this piece is coming out in representations occasioned by Judith Butler, I was really curious about all of these various routes into non-binary, but it was attended by what you described as searching for some kind of cisgender sense of belonging or cisgender euphoria maybe, right? And coming up with ambivalence, which seems to me to be the very project of gender itself, as Butler illuminated, right? So, so in looking at this, these like ideas about how one might throw a wrench in the system, it's curious to me. I remain kind of still curious about this question around like gender is not radical, right? Like is that the kind of preamble to the six that like there's really no kind of radical position to be in, and that like maybe non-binary is certainly like embedded in woke culture, but to identify as non-binary, let's say, might be to also identify that gender is a rapidly shifting ecology by which one should reasonably feel ambivalent. The other kind of question is, crap, I think I lost it with all of the...
Oh no.
Maybe I'll pause here, and I know that there was only one question, so maybe I'll just have to raise my follow. Oh, it's about mourning. It's about public cultures of fairies. So I feel like there are places where like fairies go in Tennessee, for example. Radical fairies meet up for like long hangouts with each other, festivals and all that. So I'm thinking about the mourning as it relates to the kind of publicness of something like non-binary and trans that gets mobilized for various kinds of political, cultural, etc. But that maybe something that is also happening is that like fairy culture has become far more covert, and that like it could in fact also be opened up to. We might then ask another question, which is like, is the lack of public culture around fairy also indicative of another mode for protection?
That's a great question. I mean, both great ideas.
Can I just add something to Riley's too?
No. Okay.
The morning again, that I was thinking like, one thing I think would be so interesting if you develop this is, I would wager as someone who works at the Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation, that it's actually those kinds of groups that lead to it, because that's the image of like the fairy or the feminine gay man is the thing that starts to seem stereotypical or negative towards people who get to control culture, right? And so I think like you're going to start to see that kind of policing of like the images of gay men in particular on TV, and that as being like a way in which it gets erased, right? It's like through that kind of cultural policing of like what images of gay men seem fair, balanced, and whatever the third word God has is.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, thank you, Riley. Those are both like really interesting ideas that I hadn't really thought of. And so I guess I want to talk to you more about this idea of non-binary as ambivalence, right? As an ambivalent relation to gender, right? Because I had been, and I imagine that is, it does sound like that can be one of the ways that non-binary is lived, right? But I was like putting the accent more on the other form of non-binary that's like, I'm going to find and name and claim my precise gender, right? Which has not been adequately named by any of these other terms, right? And the kind of idea, of divergence, of rejection of terms that are not exact, right? And possibly belief in the possibility of there being an exact term, right? So yes, I would love to hear more about non-binary ambivalence from you. And, but yeah, in terms of gender not being radical, yes, absolutely, yes, 100%. And then in terms of the fairy going covert, like I am interested in thinking about, what happens to fairies, like, or people who would have been fairies or something like that, what happens to contemporary feminine men, right? I think sometimes they learn to lift weights and like grow a mustache, right? And that makes them like, more reasonably attractive. Like people can overlook their femininity and pretend it's not there, right? They can be a twink for a while, right? And and as long as they're like youthful and beautiful and like ready for sex, that femininity can pass, right? But then age becomes a huge problem, right? So apparently there are all these jokes about, you know, after an aged twink, you know, has two routes. Either they become a twunk, that is, they beef up, right, and start to act more masculine, or they transition. So I'm interested in that kind of subcultural knowledge of the twink to trans femininity pipeline, if you will, right? And just all these kind of underground knowledges, right? So in other words, this is a group of people that still, I mean, I don't know if we would even say a group, right? Because as you say, it's not a publicly identifiable category, right? But this is a tendency, you know, that still exists. But I think that must find various ways to pass by, right, within a gender system and a system of sexual desire, right, that doesn't really have a place for them, right? So yes, I think I will definitely think more about that and the relationship to protection, to hypervisibility, to code switching, for instance, and so on. So thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic questions.